In this video, I'm going to show you how I paint a snow scheme for the Death Korps of Krieg. Hello and welcome to another brushstroke painting guide. I'm Brushstroke, and as you heard from the intro there, the topic for this video is going to be painting the Death Korps of Krieg, and specifically an alternative paint scheme I've been wanting to try out for a while, which is more of a winter snow theme. Now I know what you're thinking, you hate painting white and it's really hard, and why would you paint an army which is all painted white? Well, bear with me, because in this video I'm going to show you how I painted this white and it took no effort at all, and it's really quick and simple to do. But before we start, if you're new to the channel and you haven't watched my videos before, then there's a few things which I think you'd really benefit from. And the first one is I have a playlist of videos which are specifically the techniques and fundamentals of painting which I use throughout all of my videos. So if you'd like to see more details on those, anything from paint thinning to how to load your brush and dry brushing, that kind of thing, then please do check out that playlist, because I think you'll find it really useful. And the second one is I get asked all the time what paintbrushes I use, so if you'd like to know more details about those, then please check out the link above. Okay, so let's make a start on some painting, and for the benefit of those of you who have just skipped through the intro, I did say that this guide is going to include a super easy and quick white recipe to help making painting white armies a breeze. And the first step for that begins with your choice of primer colour. So when you're painting light colours, especially white, then why not make life a lot easier for yourself and simply prime with a pale grey or white primer. And in this particular case, I've gone for grey surface primer from Vallejo. So with my model now primed and ready for painting, I'm just going to make a start, and I'm going to paint in my first colour, which is going to be for the pale blue trousers. And for this, I'm going to use some Fenrisian Grey from Games Workshop. So nice and simple step to start off with. All I'm going to do is paint in the light blue details on the model here, which is actually going to be not only the trousers, but I'm also going to do around the neck detail as well, like it's an undercoat or garment, something like that. Now I'm using my bigger brush here just because I can get it done nice and quickly. I am being a little bit neat, but that's not really necessary for you. You can be as careful as you like. I'm just being neat so it's easier to see things on video. But the aim here really is to get this on cleanly and smoothly, so I've thinned it with a little bit of water on my palette, and I'll apply it as a couple of coats to make sure I get a nice strong colour over this nice pale grey primer. And as I mentioned, I'm also going to paint in the detail inside the coat's collar here, just around the gas mask, just paint that into the blue detail as well, just to give that contrast from the white overcoat. Okay, so that's two coats of the Fenrisian Grey done now, and next I'm going to do the first step of painting the white overcoat, for which I'm going to use Ulthorn Grey from Games Workshop. However, this colour can sometimes be a little bit tricky to apply super smoothly by hand, and I did promise that this would be a quick and simple recipe to get your army onto the tabletop. So I'm actually going to use the airbrush version of this paint, but apply it by hand. I know, right? Mind blown. But there is method to the madness here, because the airbrush version actually skips the need to worry about getting the paint to a thin and even consistency, as it's already done that in the pot. All you need to do is ensure it is shaken well and applied over a pale primer, and then you can brush it on straight from the pot, as I'm doing here. Now, of course, if you are lucky enough to have an airbrush, you can make things even easier for yourself and actually airbrush this step, and then just paint the Fenrisian Grey details in over the top. But painting it this way really isn't that much more difficult. You just have a few things that you need to be careful of. So obviously you're dealing with a nicely thinned down paint, so you need to make sure that you have control of it. Apply it nice and smoothly and evenly across the surface. Don't let it run away from yourself or pull up in any of the recesses. You're just looking to apply it evenly over the surface. And obviously you can see just how thin it is, and because of that you are going to need to apply multiple coats in order to get to a solid finish. But because you're painting over such a light primer, this is pretty easy to do, and if you're batch painting you'll find that it dries quick enough so that when you get back to the first mini it's already ready for its next coat. In this particular case, it only took me 3 coats in order to build up to a nice solid finish and to move on to the next stage. And that next stage is going to be painting in the strappings around the legs, and for this, normal service is resumed because I'm going to use a normal paint, and in this case it's going to be Karak Stone from Games Workshop. So again, a really nice and simple step this. All I'm going to do is paint in the strapping on the bottom of the legs here. Of course, now I've got a few colours on the model, I am going to be nice and careful wherever I paint up against those colours. Like on the bottom of the trouser, I'm going to make sure I try to get a nice sharp, clean, neat line. If of course you do make any mistakes, then don't panic, just let it dry and you can always neaten things back up again with whichever colour you need. You should find that even though you thin this down with a bit of water to get it flowing, it does cover quite well over the pale primer, so just 1 or 2 coats at maximum should be all you need to get to that solid finish. Okay, so that's how it's looking now, and actually it's already looking pretty cool. These are such great looking models, to be fair. So moving on now, I'm going to paint in all of the leather details, and that's things like the boots, belts, straps, gloves, backpack, that sort of thing. And for this, I'm going to use some orange leather from scale 75. Okay, so for this stage we're going to need to start getting a little bit neater now because we've got more colours painted in and some of these straps are quite fine details, so I've stepped down to a smaller brush so I've got that extra bit of control. I've done the usual thing, I've thinned the paint down on my palette so it's flowing really cleanly and smoothly from the brush, and I'm only taking a small amount at a time so I've got that extra bit of control so I can get these nice details and try and get some nice sharp lines for these straps. As always though, if you do make mistakes, don't panic, that's just painting, don't worry about it. Just let it dry and you can always neaten things back up again with whichever colour you need. And that does include the white. You will find that you'll still be able to get your Ulthorn grey painted over the top of any of these colours and neaten things back up again. There is actually a surprisingly large amount of leather details on these models, so do make sure that you work your way around and pick them all out. You'll find that the coverage of the scale 75 paint when it's thinned down is quite translucent, so as always make sure that you build up with multiple layers to get to a nice solid finish. Okay, so for my next base coat colour I'm going to paint in all of the armour panels, and I want these to be quite a high contrast against the white trench coat that we've already painted in. So I'm going to go for a really dark, almost black metallic, and for this I'm going to use some steel from Dark Star Miniatures. Now this is an absolutely lovely paint, and when it's thinned down it goes on so nicely, but as with all metallics it does suffer if you paint it over a pale primer. They work much better if you paint them over black, but in this particular case it's such a strong colour, so don't panic when you put that first coat on and it looks a little bit patchy. Just applying a couple of thin coats will actually get you to a nice solid finish, and it's such a dark glossy metallic, and for this it's going to look really cool. Not forgetting of course to paint in the shin armour plates here, and of course the helmet. And now just to show you the difference that the second coat makes over that first sort of patchy first coat, you can see here that this builds up to a nice solid finish. So don't panic when that first coat looks really bad and really patchy. Okay, so for the next base coat, it's a bit of an optional step really. I just thought it would look quite cool if the trench coat had some contrasting collar and cuff details. So for this I'm going to paint them in a dark blue, but you could equally paint them in maybe like a dark grey, and that would look pretty cool as well. So for this I'm going to use some Abyss Blue from 2 thin coats. So as I say, this is quite an optional step. I just think having those contrasting cuffs and collar to the coat make it have that little bit more detail, a little bit more interest. Now you might decide that blue is not the colour that you want. In fact, actually it's a good way of personalising your units, and you could maybe have different colours for different units or different colours for different grades. It's really up to you. But as always, just take your time, paint these details in, be as neat as you can. If you make any mistakes, then correct it and move on to the next stage. And that next stage is I'm going to very quickly paint in the eye lenses of the gas mask. I don't want to be too detailed here, so I'm just going to very quickly take advantage of the pale primer that we've got, and I'm going to paint them in with a 50-50 mix of Angron Red Clear and Larmium Medium from Games Workshop. And very simply, all I'm going to do is paint in my thinned down mixture, my 50-50 mix. I'm going to paint that into each of the eye lenses and just let it pool up. I'm going to do one coat and then leave it. And the idea of this is because it's over that pale primer, it'll just settle into the recesses and around the edges, and it'll give a nice darker rim to the outline and paler in the middle. And that's all I'm going to do. Now, if you've accidentally painted over this area whilst painting in some of the other details, don't worry. All you need to do is paint in the eye lenses with a pale grey, maybe your Ulthorn grey for example, and then apply this over the top and you'll get exactly the same effect. Okay, so that's fully dry now, and as you can see, it's not particularly neat around the edges, but don't worry, we'll sort that out later. So now I'm going to paint in the rubber part of the face mask and the hose, and for this I'm going to use some Storm Vermin Fur from Games Workshop. So very carefully paint in the outside of the skull detail here of the face mask, and I'm also going to paint in between each of the teeth and in the nose hole as well, and then carefully paint in the hose from the gas mask as well. For the next step, this is kind of more of a catch-all colour really, just for any sort of details that doesn't have a natural colour. So it's like the handle on weapons, any tools, miscellaneous blankets, that kind of thing. And for this, I'm going to use some Eshen Grey from Games Workshop. So like I say, this is a good generic colour for this scheme, so you can paint in things like the grips on the tools on the back of his backpack here, the grips on the weapons as well, both pistol and sword, and then generic items like the blanket on the back here, that if you don't want them to stand out particularly, then just using this generic grey is a great way of having it tie in but not stand out too much. Okay, so let's paint in the rest of the silver details now, and that's going to be things like the rest of the gun here, the sword, the tools on his backpack, that kind of thing. And for this, I'm going to use some graphite from Dark Star Miniatures. So again, because I'm painting a metallic colour over a pale base colour, it will look a bit patchy to start with just because you thin it down to get a smooth finish. But don't be alarmed, just like it did with the darker colour, if you apply a couple of coats you'll get a nice strong shiny smooth finish and it'll look fabulous. So trust with the process, apply it as thin coats and build up to a solid colour. Okay, which brings me on to my final base coat colour now, and that's going to be all of the gold or brass details. Now I wanted this to be quite a muted colour, so I'm actually going to go for a more of a brass look, and for this I'm going to use some Regency gold from Dark Star Miniatures. So it's exactly the same as the two previous metallics that we've applied over this pale base coat. You will find, because you've thinned it down, the coverage doesn't seem that great, and in fact actually with the gold you'll probably find it's even worse. It sort of feels like it's smearing rather than covering. Do not panic, that is absolutely fine. Just get it on cleanly and smoothly, and then when you start to add the additional layers you'll find it builds up really quickly and you'll get a lovely smooth finish. Trust in the process. It does look horrible after the first coat, it's not a problem. After the second, possibly a third coat, you will get a solid finish. If it really does bother you that it doesn't look good on the first coat, you could actually apply an undercoat of maybe a warm brown and you'll find this gold goes over the top a lot easier and it looks a lot better. But it's really not that necessary. As long as you understand that you're actually building up that colour and that metallic fleck with the multiple layers, then it doesn't really matter. Just don't be tempted to try and smear more on than you need, because all that'll end up happening is it will dry in clumps and it'll look really ugly and you'll get really frustrated. So just do as I've always recommended, which is thin your paints, apply it as multiple thin coats, and you'll get a lovely finish. And of course, not forgetting to paint in all of the lovely brass buttons on the trench coat, just to add that extra little bit of detail and pop. So that's all the base coats painted in now, and now's the time to go over the mini and do any of those tidy ups that are needed. And mostly that's going to be around the areas where you've gone over on the white. Definitely going to need to do some cleanup on the gas mask here, around those lenses where I've overspilled. So just work your way around and tidy up any of those messy details before moving on to the next stage. Okay, so with everything now nicely tidied up, it's looking really nice, and we can start adding some shadow and shade to our model. Starting off with all of the Frisian grey details, and for this I'm going to use some Space Wolves grey contrast paint thinned down with some contrast medium. Now it's important that you use the contrast medium here and not the Lamium medium that we used before, because they are very different mixtures, and the ratio I've used for this is about 50-50. And the reason for thinning it down is because the contrast paint on its own is actually quite a strong colour and it stains it too dark for my needing. I want this to be quite subtle, so all I'm going to do is apply it over all of the Frisian grey details and let it settle nicely into all of those creases and recesses, and then leave it to dry fully before moving on to the next stage. Okay, so with that contrast wash now dry, I can move on to adding shadows and highlights to the white. And to do this, I'm going to use exactly the same process as before, using a thinned down contrast paint, just like in the last step. This time though, I'm going to use Apothecary White contrast thinned with some contrast medium from Games Workshop. The ratio I'm using is again 50-50 contrast paint to contrast medium, as that makes for a lovely soft and subtle shading result. It also makes the mixture flow more, resulting in it running off all of the highest areas and only settling in the creases and recesses, effectively creating both shadow and highlight in one step. Now, a word of warning here: by thinning the contrast so much, you need to not get carried away and try and add too much, as that will flood the model, and instead you want to simply wet the surface and only let it collect in the folds and the recesses. Otherwise you'll get too strong a result and it just won't look right. Remember, gravity is your friend here, so try and use it to your advantage and orientate the model so that it encourages it to settle into the lowest points where you want it to go. When applied right, you shouldn't be able to see any difference on the flat or raised areas, maybe just a little bit shiny because they're wet, and a nice soft grey shadow in all of the recesses. Once you're happy, let that first coat dry fully, and then you can decide if the result is strong enough or if you want to darken it down in certain places. For example, the deepest of those folds might need a little bit more, and then what you can do is you can apply a second coat of the 50-50 mix to those areas as a recess shade, just to darken those down a little bit more. I've actually made a video on shading and wash techniques, so if you'd like a little bit more help and guidance on getting this right, then please do check out this link above. Okay, so once that second coat is fully dry, then that's it, the white is done. How quick and easy was that? The thinned down contrast adds just enough shading to achieve a lovely soft and smooth white, which means we can now go on and add a shade to all of the leather details, and for this I'm going to use some Agrax Earth Shade from Games Workshop. So very simple step this, all you need to do is apply it neat, straight from the bottle over all of the leather details, and also includes the Carax stone leg strappings that we did on the ankles here as well, and just push it round, let it settle into all of those recesses, bring out all of that detail and add in that shadow. Do take your time though and be nice and careful. You don't want to get this onto any areas that you don't want it to, so just take your time, use a medium-sized brush and push it around, and then once you've finished, let it dry completely before moving on to the next stage. Which brings us on to the final wash, and that's going to be to all of the remaining details, so all of the metallics including the brass, then also the Eshin grey details and storm vermin fur, and for this I'm going to use some null oil from Games Workshop. So just a repeat of the last stage really, except this time I'm going to paint it over all of the metallics. That's really handy because it means that you don't need to worry about painting over the brass details. It actually brings out a nice patina kind of aged effect to it. So you can just work your way around the model, picking out all of the details. Like the whole of the sword here, I can do the Norn oil over all of the blade, then also round the brass hilt at the bottom here, the strapping for the handle, and then equally the tools on the back of his backpack and the handles for those in Eshen Grey as well, the blanket, and of course all of the dark armor panels including all of their brass details, and then finally all of the Storm Vermin fur details such as the hosing here and the sides of the gas mask. Okay, so that's all the washes done now, and as you can see it's really brought out that detail, but it has darkened it down quite a bit. It's actually looking pretty cool though, and if you wanted to call it a day, that's more than a good enough tabletop quality, I would say. But if you want to take it that extra level, you can always add in some more details. So we're going to start and do that now by adding some highlights to all of the leather details, and for this I'm going to use some Baneblade Brown from Games Workshop. So what I'm looking to do for this step is pick out all the nice edges and areas which will be catching the most light on the leather pouches here, and all of the leather straps and details across the model. So I'm just taking my brush and I'm using the side of it there just to pick out those sharp edges. I've thinned the paint so the paint does flow nice and smoothly, but I don't have an awful lot in the bristles so it doesn't run out of control, and all I'm trying to do is barely touch the surface just so that it very lightly skims that top edge, and it means that I can produce a nice clean sharp line. Now if you would like more tips and tricks in terms of how to do edge highlighting and areas which have helped me improve on my edge highlighting skills, then please do check out the link above because I think you'll find it very useful. Otherwise it's just a case of very patiently working your way around the model, picking out all of these nice edges and highlighting them in with the Baneblade Brown. Okay, so with those highlights now added to the leather, you probably notice that they do look quite stark and not really giving that warm leather effect. So I'm now going to tie that together by applying a glaze over all of the leather, and for this I'm going to use some Seraphim Sepia from Games Workshop. So what do I mean by applying a glaze? Well, actually all it is I'm going to use a wash straight from the bottle, but this time rather than applying it so that it pulls up into the recesses, I'm just going to apply it as a very thin layer so it just basically wets the surface. Now what that's going to do is it's going to do two things. It's basically going to bring some warmth and tint back to the overall leather colour that we have, but it's also going to slightly darken down and tint those highlights that I've just added and basically bring everything together so it feels like it's all one thing. So all I'm going to do is just work my way around the model and apply a thin layer across all of the leather details. Now for my next highlight, I'm just going to brighten back up the leg strappings, and for this I'm just going to apply a layer of Karak stone from Games Workshop. So for this step I'm not really looking to just pick out the edges, I'm really just painting back in each of the straps and leaving the darker recessed areas untouched. So I thin the paint down so it's a little bit translucent, and I'm just going to apply a very thin layer just to pick out the details of each of those straps and just to give it a little bit more definition. Now don't be too alarmed when this first goes on because it will look very bright, but when it dries it does darken down and blends in nicely. Next, I'm just going to add a quick edge highlight to all of the blue collar and cuff details, and for this I'm going to use some Witching Hour blue from 2 thin coats. Okay, so moving on now, I'm going to add some highlights to all of the dark armor panels, and this time I'm going to do it a little bit differently because I want to add a little bit of battle wear and chipping and that kind of thing, and for this I'm going to use some chrome from Vallejo. Now what I've done is I've loaded my brush in the normal way, but instead of trying to just do a thin line across the top, what I'm actually going to do is just gently bounce my bristles against the edge in like a skipping motion, so it just creates a little series of dots and skips across the top, and that gives like the impression of chipping and dents in that edge, so it's like the light's catching some but not others. And then also looking to pick out each of these little rivets as well, just to give a bit of emphasis and highlight to those. So then it's just a case of working your way around and picking out all of these edges. It's actually very easy to do and very satisfying, just bounce your little bristles across those edges. You could also maybe look to do some scratches and little dints in the panels as well by just putting little dots and lines across each of those panels to give the impression of scratches and damage. So just work your way around and add all your little dots to all of those edges. I also decided to use the same colour just to highlight all of the silver details, just to keep things simple and quick too. And when you're done, you should end up with something that looks a little bit like this. Which then brings us on to the final highlight for this model, and that's going to be to all of the brass details. And for this I'm just going to use some Regency Gold from Darkstar Miniatures. And all I'm looking to do for this step really is just pick out those areas that I want to add that little bit of shine. I don't want these details to be super shiny, I want them to be more muted and dull. So I'm just picking out the topmost edges or any areas where I want that detail just to shine out a little bit more. So just work your way around and pick out those details. Not forgetting of course to pick out those nice brass buttons just so that they really pop too. Okay, so with that brass now highlighted, the model is essentially finished, with the exception of one last stage which I want to do, which is some dirt and weathering. But in order to do that I'm going to get it based first, so let's do that now. Isn't the magic of YouTube brilliant? So as you can see, what I've done is I've done a snow themed base, obviously. Now if you're interested in the techniques I've used to create these snow effects, then please hang on to the end of this video, where I'll be including it in the further watching links at the end. Okay, so all I'm going to do to this model now, just to finish it off, is I'm going to add some dirt to the bottom of his trench coat here, and then sort of around his feet and boots and stuff. And for this, what I'm going to use is a weathering powder. Now, it doesn't really matter which brand you use, they're all essentially the same thing, they're ground up pigments, but the one I'm going to use for this particular one is from Cromlech, and it's called Dark Dirt. So if you've not used weathering powders before, then let me take you through the steps. Now the first thing to say is this is actually quite a messy process, so do it somewhere where you don't mind making a mess. This stuff does seem to get everywhere. Now what you need to get is some kitchen towel and then an old scrap brush that you can use to apply it. An old dry brush is great. And you just take some of the powder and put it onto your paper. Rub it in as if you were doing like a dry brush effect, and then that's your brush loaded. And then all you need to do is you can apply it to your model where you want it to in a dry brush motion. So just rub it against the surface of the model where you want to apply that dirt or pigment, and then just rub that into the surface. Now like I say, this can get quite messy, so just be prepared, and it is quite easy to apply too much too quickly, but don't worry about that either, because you can actually remove it as well. So all you need to do to take off any excess that you might have put on is you grab a nice blob of blue tack or silly putty, and then you can just use that as an eraser and just take away where you don't want that extra pigment to be. Now this is a really useful technique, because what you can do, you can actually do some blending and smoothing of the edges of this, so it gives the impression that it's ground in rather than sitting on top. And then you can just go back and forth adding more of your pigment or taking it off where you don't want it to be, until you get to a finish that you're happy with. So something along the lines of this. So what I've done is I've added it to the bottom of the trench coat, both inside and out. I've done it around the boots and across the knees. Also did it a bit on the elbows as well, just to give the impression that he might have rubbed against things and laid in it, all that kind of stuff. Now it's entirely up to you how much or how little weathering you want to do on your models, but what I would say is have a play around, see what you like. It's very quick and easy to do, and you can get some really cool effects. When you are happy with your end result, then there is one final step that you're going to need to do, otherwise you will find that it will just rub away, and that is to seal it on with a matte varnish. Now I tend to do this with my airbrush because it's nice and quick, but you can also get it in rattle can as well, and all you need to do is a very light dusting over the whole model, and that will just stop it from rubbing away when you're playing with it on the tabletop. Okay, so with the weathering complete and it's sealed onto the model is complete. Thank you so much for watching. I really hope you have enjoyed this video. If you have, then please do give it a like and comment below what you'd like to see me paint next. As always, a massive thank you to the members of the channel whose names are going across the screen now. Your support helps keep the channel going and it's really appreciated. If you have enjoyed this video and you would like to see more, then please do hit that subscribe button and don't forget to click the notification bell to be told whenever I post another video. Speaking of other videos, I'd love it if you stayed on the channel, so why not check out how I did the snow effects for the base on this model, or perhaps how to add decals to your model, or maybe even the glow effect I used for the power sword. Thanks again for watching, hope to see you again soon.